Folks, welcome back to Sub2 Investor. My name is Hans, and in this episode, I'm going to be giving you 10 reasons why lease options are your best friend in 2025. You are not going to want to miss this one. Now, as you know, I am all about creating massive passive income in my real estate business, and lease options are a crucial component to that formula. I talk a lot about purchasing Sub2 or with seller financing, but in my humble opinion, the magic to creating that passive income is really in your exit strategy. We can talk about financing and acquisitions, but if your exit strategy doesn't allow you to collect income from real estate in a passive manner, well then everything you do on the front end of your transaction doesn't really matter. So I'm going to be talking about lease options in this video, specifically why I really like lease options. Now, let's clarify, what do I mean by lease option? You'll hear the term lease and option. That's actually probably my favorite term and the term I should be using throughout this video. You'll hear the term lease purchase or rent to own. All of these can be the same thing. And there are many variations on how you can do a lease option or a rent to own. And we're not going to get into that in this video. But what a lease and option is, when I refer to a lease option or a lease purchase, it's two contracts. It's two separate documents, namely a lease document, just like a standard rental agreement. That's number one. And then the second document is a option to purchase contract. This second document is totally independent of this lease agreement over here. And it's just giving the individual who happens to also be leasing your property, it's giving that individual the exclusive right to purchase that property for a certain price for certain terms. That's all it's doing. It's just giving them the option and the exclusive right to buy that real estate with certain terms and at a certain price. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a lease option. And my real estate business utilizes lease options very frequently. It's basically lease and options or some form of seller financing, either contract for a deed or a wraparound mortgage. And in my opinion, that right there is the winning formula for creating massive passive income. It just so happens that I really like acquiring using subject to financing or seller financing. So that's it. Now let's get into the 10 reasons why lease options are your best friend in 2025 and probably going forward. Now, the first reason why I really like lease and options is because this gives me a chance to try out my tenant buyer or tenant optionee, as some people might call them. But I'm just going to say tenant buyer. I think that just has a better ring to it. It gives me a chance to test out my tenant buyer to see if they are going to be a on-time payer, and just like a good payer, somebody who pays on time and is not bugging me about all sorts of things going on in the property. Because my goal when I do a lease and option is different from the way most people do lease and options, which is really just to collect that fee, get higher rents, and then once that person fails to perform, you kick them out, you do it again. That's not my model. My model is to try and get these tenant buyers, people doing lease and options with me, to convert them over to seller financing so that I can have long-term, truly passive income off of the note or the contract for deed that I structure once that tenant buyer converts over and becomes just a buyer that I'm financing the house to. So number one, this gives me a chance to test out this individual to see if they are going to pay on time. And maybe I'll drive by that property to see what kind of shape they're going to keep it in, because this will make an impact on whether or not they're able to qualify for seller financing, or whether I choose to give them that opportunity to purchase the house from me with seller financing, which again is my chief goal when I do a lease and option. Now, number two is that you are going to get some skin in the game up front. Now, typically with lease and options, you're getting around 3 to 5% of the purchase price down. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule by any stretch of the imagination. There are some situations in which it makes sense to collect a much larger option fee from your tenant buyer. However, on average, we're talking 3 to 5% of the purchase price down. Now, when you're juxtaposing lease and options to just standard long-term rentals, you are getting quite a bit of skin in the game with, if it's 5, 10, 15 grand, 20 grand down, whatever it might be on your option fee that you're collecting up front from your tenant buyer, they are far more likely to perform, to do some improvements and repairs to the property and take care of it like it's their own during this rental period where they are just a tenant buyer and not really a buyer yet. Again, this is really in juxtaposition to long-term rentals, where you have tenants move into a property with very little skin in the game, oftentimes just 1 month's worth of a security deposit, which quite honestly often is not enough to cover the make-ready expense when that tenant moves out, and then you have to repaint the property, replace carpet, repair things. So you're getting a substantial amount of skin in the game, not as much skin in the game as when you sell a property with seller financing, where you're collecting, say, 10% down payment, which is what I'd say is industry standard right now. But you are still getting a significant skin in the game. And typically, I'd say we're aiming more toward that 5% at a minimum down on a lease option. There's very few instances where I'm going to take less than that, just because I do not want to have to intervene in that property at all. I want to just treat it like I have sold it with seller financing, even though I haven't, but I want the tenant buyer to really take care of the property, not bug me with property concerns. And having that skin in the game, I mean, they're basically homeowners in training, right? It's almost like they've given you a down payment and they own the house, although they haven't, but it's just this training period, and that skin in the game goes a long way, in my opinion. Number 3, why lease options are fantastic, is that you can still file an eviction to take a property back from an unpaying tenant, because you've signed a lease agreement over here, which is just totally independent from this purchase option contract. And that's the way I would suggest you do your lease and options, although I am not an attorney and nothing I say in this video is legal advice. I would make them independent of each other so that the lease stands alone and the purchase option stands alone. So if you have an unpaying tenant who's not paying their rent and your lease allows you to file an eviction and get them out of the property, well, then you can still do that with a lease and option. Now, that's in contradistinction to seller financing, especially wraparound mortgages, where you've actually conveyed title over to your buyer. In that case, your legal recourse would be what any other lender's recourse is, which is to file a foreclosure and foreclose on the property to take it back. Now, with contract for deed, another form of seller financing, there are instances where you can still file for an eviction or an ejectment, which is kind of in between an eviction and a foreclosure. In some states, at least some states where I do business, if the equity of the buyer is below a certain percentage, like 20% or something like that, contract for deeds can have that benefit for them. However, even on contract for deed, if they have a substantial amount of equity in the property, you're still going to have to foreclose in some situations and not be able to evict. And that's why a lease and option can be a really great place to start with a prospective buyer that you're planning to seller finance the house to. Number 4, you can close the deal. I shouldn't say close the deal because you're not technically closing, but you can execute the transaction with your tenant buyer a lot faster than you can do a wraparound mortgage, where you have to go through title. There's a lot of complicated paperwork and disclosures you have to provide. The buyer has to go get their own home insurance, and it's a pretty big ordeal to do seller financing with a wraparound mortgage. Contract for deed is a lot simpler, but it's still a bigger ordeal. You're able to do the transaction a lot faster as soon as you find somebody who's got the option fee and can qualify with you and your standards for whatever they might be to do a lease and option. Then as soon as they're ready to go, you're ready to go, then you get together, sign the paperwork, collect the option fee, first month's rent, and the deal is essentially done. In a similar vein, there are no closing costs unless you happen to be using an attorney to draft any of your paperwork. Since you're not closing at a title company, again, you're not using an RMLO, although you could, if you wanted to, kind of see where the tenant buyer is going to land in terms of qualifying for seller financing. But because you're not required to use title to do a lease and option, at least not in my state, again, seek your own legal counsel on the matter. The closing costs are next to nothing. In fact, for me, they are nothing except for my time and my energy, whereas doing a wraparound mortgage, I have to pay title fees. Because it's a sale, I might have to make some seller concessions potentially. And also there's paying the RMLO, though you can get reimbursed for that by your buyer. It's still more costly to do a seller finance wraparound transaction. Even a contract for deed, if you plan to have it filed at the county or have an attorney close it and do escrow and whatnot, it's going to cost you a little bit of money. And so with a lease and option, you don't have any closing costs. Number 6, it's much easier to explain a lease and option to your average individual, at least least I've found in my markets. Most people know the term rent to own, and they have some vague notion of them living in the property and paying something extra for the opportunity of home ownership. Although most people don't really understand how it works like at all, and so you have to explain it to basically everybody. Essentially, you're starting with some common ground. People know rent to own. Almost everybody's heard that term and is familiar with it. In fact, I've even, this is a side note, utilized that term when marketing for seller finance buyers because it gets people in the door, and then I can further explain to them and clarify this isn't actually a rental, this is actually a seller financing sale transaction. But I do find that in general, it's a easier sell to do a rent to own or a lease and option with an individual than it is with seller financing, whereas seller financing just seems so foreign to certain people that they really have a lot to wrap their minds around before they feel comfortable with the idea of buying on a contract for deed or doing a wraparound mortgage. There's a lot more to explain in those transactions than there is with a lease and option, where again, it's two simple documents, at least the way I do them, with a lease agreement and an option to purchase agreement, which are totally independent documents. The timeframes just happen to align perfectly with each other. Now, this leads to number 7, why lease and options are your best friend, and that is that the paperwork, which I was just talking about a second ago, is supremely easy to fill out. You're probably familiar with rental agreements or lease agreements, so you fill that out and then you fill out the purchase option contract. Now, if you need a professional to get some information from on how to do that, or if you don't have a template that you feel very confident utilizing, well then go to my website, sub2investor.com, or reach out to me by email, hans@sub2investor.com, and I have templates which you can purchase right now if you wanted to do the deal, say tomorrow. And if you guys purchase any of those documents and templates from my website, feel free to shoot me an email if you have a question about this or that, and I'd be happy to clarify. Although I must always stress that you should seek your own legal counsel, get any documents you purchase from me reviewed by a local attorney qualified in your area. But it's so helpful to have an investor with some experience under their belt to talk to when you're filling out these forms for the first time. And so I hope that if you are wanting to do lease and options, that you consider either joining my mentorship or checking out the paperwork, template packages. But also, you're probably smart enough that you can figure this stuff out on your own. Now, number 8, and here I have to tell you that I'm not a tax professional and that you should seek your own professional tax counsel. But here's my opinion on the matter about lease and options. If you are doing rent to owns, lease and options, then you are clearly renting out investment properties, and you are clearly purchasing properties with the intent to hold them and then sell them at a later time for a higher price. And that's exactly what we do when we convert over to seller financing. Now, what this helps with is if your LLC is a company that is a real estate investing company that is holding property, that's buying property as investment, well then doing a lease and option clearly falls within that. It's clearly an investment property that you're purchasing and then you're holding for some time before you finally sell it. And this may sound super obvious, but if you have any familiarity with tax code, then you'll know that what you don't want is to be classified as a dealer if you're just doing seller financing transactions. Like all the time, every single deal is just a wraparound mortgage or seller finance deal, and you hold no investment properties. Well, then what could happen, from my understanding, is that you could be reclassified as a broker of a good or service and not as an investor. And that has really, really massive tax implications. And so utilizing lease and options is going to clearly fall in line with your LLC's intent to be investors and hold investment properties, if that's what your LLC operating agreement states your purpose and intent is, right? I know for some of you that may not be the case. You might be an S Corp or file as an S Corp. That's totally fine. But if you're playing the investment game, then lease and options can be really great from a tax strategy standpoint. Let's talk about number 9. Similarly, holding that property for some time, renting it out, makes it very easy to use the installment sale method on your tax return or your LLC's tax return. If you've never done that before, then And you're probably just like, okay, what's installment sale? But basically what it allows you to do is you have capital gains. Once you sell that investment property on seller financing, your basis and then what you sell it for, and there's a gain there. And what the installment sale method on your taxes allows you to do is essentially only pay the capital gain that you collect in the given year. So that way you're not paying on a gain that you haven't realized yet. And so holding the property for some time, then doing a seller finance sale after you've held it as an investment property makes it very easy to do that installment sale. That would be number 9, a little bit technical, but once you start talking to your tax professional about all this stuff, then it's gonna all become clear and you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, lease and options. And finally, this leads to number 10, which is that the option fee that you collect, right? I don't call it a down payment. I don't refer to it as a down payment because it's not a down payment. It's not giving that tenant optionee any equitable interest in the property. It's just a fee which they pay to have the exclusive right to buy that property at a set price for a certain amount of time with set terms, right? Because that's a sacrifice on my behalf. I can't go out and sell that property now. I'm locked into a potential sale. And so it costs me something. I'm gonna get paid for what that costs me to make that commitment to this person. So it's just a fee. It's an option fee. That's how I describe it in paperwork that I use. And that option fee, from my understanding, and again, seek your own tax professional advice, that option fee is not taxed in the year you collect it. It only becomes taxable when your tenant buyer exercises their option to buy, or if they default and that becomes forfeited monies and that's your liquidated damages, well then at that point, then it becomes taxable income for you. So it will become taxable income for you, but in the year that you collect it, it doesn't. What's cool about the lease and option is that fee you collect from your tenant buyer, you're not paying any taxes on that in the year you collect it until that gets applied to the purchase of the house, or it becomes forfeited as liquidated damages for a terminated contract. That's it, guys. That's 10 reasons why lease and options, whatever you decide to call it, are your best friend in 2025. The method is such a great instrument to have in your pocket for so many different reasons. I feel like if I sat here long enough, I could probably come up with another 10 reasons why I like lease and options. That's not to say there aren't downsides. That'll be for another video. No method is perfect and doesn't carry any risk. Of course, there's a risk with doing lease and options. There's a risk with doing long-term rentals. There's risks with doing short-term rentals or seller financing, contract for deed. Everything has its own risks, but in my estimation, the benefits of doing a lease and option are so great that it far outweighs the risks. I hope you enjoyed this content though. If you found it useful, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment with any questions you have about doing lease and options. I would love to respond to those. If you want to check out any of my coaching products on my website, sub2investor.com, or my lease and option paperwork templates, those are available on my website as well. Until next time, guys, stay creative. Peace.